Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the RSA. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm very excited about hearing from Peter Rees in a few moments. I just wanted to remind you that we'd like to be uninterrupted by the sound of mobile phones. But we're happy for you to keep your phones on and to use Twitter. The hashtag for the event is RSA Reese. And also a welcome to our online audience. This event is being filmed, so there are people joining us from around the world to hear from Peter. So I'm Jonathan Schiffers. I'll be chairing tonight. I wanted to give a bit of background to what we're up to at the RSA and where this interesting talk and debate is going to fit into that. I guess my personal background, I used to be a planning consultant, so I was trying to get developments approved by people like Peter. And personally, I've always been interested in how the built environment affects the social and economic opportunities, especially in cities. And now here at the RSA, we're working on a year-long project which is coming to its final conclusion in a month in this room. And that project is called the City Growth Commission, and it's about how UK cities can reach their maximum potential in economic and in social performance, and really emulate some of the successes that we've seen in London in the last 30 years. And as we go forward at the RSA, we're learning from people, the likes of Peter, to work with developers, with housing associations, with local authorities, with heritage organizations and others. And I guess we're all interested here, and I hope you're interested too, to understand how institutions, practices, and policies support the kind of places and communities that we want to live in, places where the power to create is accessible and well distributed. This annual lecture was endowed by Lord Alfred Bosham, a fantastic architect and politician, in 1965. And the Bosham family have kindly continued to support these events, and we're very grateful for that, and they join us here tonight. We hope you can stay for a reception after the talk at 7 p.m. And in light of all this activity at the RSA and this legacy and continuing honor of the Bosham family, we're welcoming Peter Rees. So a bit about Peter for a minute. Peter is the Professor of City Planning, Places and City Planning at the Bartlett, UCL's Faculty for the Built Environment. He'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll expand on his talk with some questions on stage, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions from the floor and from via Twitter for our online audiences. As Chief Planning Officer for the City of London for 30 years, Peter led a huge period of planning, regeneration, renewal, new building in the city. Prior to that, Peter worked in private practice as an architect and for the London Borough of Lambeth on conservation and regeneration, places like Brixton and Vauxhall. Peter's a founding member and director of the British Council for Offices. He received their President's Award in 2003 for presiding over one of the most extensive periods of redevelopment in the city's long history. And in 2012, he was honoured with an honorary fellowship from the Royal Institute of British Architects for his services to architecture. So if you've got an opinion on the London skyline or the way the streets feel or the way the culture of the city is changing, then I'm sure you'll no doubt join me in welcoming hearing from Peter Rees.
Now, you may be a little surprised that a lifetime planner is standing before you and isn't going to show you a PowerPoint presentation. I always say to my students, you'll never catch me using PowerPoint or sitting you in a lecture theatre. You don't need to do that in London. All the questions and all the answers are just outside. So as far as I'm concerned with students, I just take them out into the streets and say, now, let's look at London, let's learn about it, let's see what's right and what's wrong. I can't do that with all of you tonight. You're far too many to walk to the pub. Otherwise, of course, I would have done. That's what I was doing only last night with the top planners from Hamburg, walking them around the city, trying to find a good pub, because that seemed to be their greatest interest. I don't need to use pictures for another reason. I look at you and I see before me a Radio 4 audience. You've brought all the pictures with you. They're in your minds. All I have to do is to flip the right switch at the right moment, and you will see the picture I want you to see. So let's see if this works. 1985, City of London, very drab place. It was so drab that the image that the world's media used to describe the city was a shot across London Bridge in the morning rush hour telephoto shot, so people look really packed together. And it was men in bowler hats, rolled umbrellas, and briefcases, heads down, trudging across the bridge from London Bridge Station into the city to their place of work. They looked just like the slaves in the opening scene of Metropolis by Fritz Lang, that early silent film. They looked bloody miserable, if I might say so. And the reason is they were coming to a workplace. They were coming to somewhere where they earned their money, and that was all. And that was the image of the city, bowler-hatted men, and all men in those days virtually, coming to work in a workplace. Now, the shot they never showed you on the television was the shot at 5 o'clock in the evening, when those same bowler-hatted chaps ran back over London Bridge to the station so they could go home to the suburbs for fun. Yes, it's true. In those days, the suburbs were more fun than the City of London. Now, when I took over as chief planner, I thought we ought to do something about that. And there was a great imperative to do something about that, because the government had just announced in 1985, just before I was appointed, that financial services were going to be deregulated the following year. And that meant that the rest of the world could come and grab a slice of London if it wanted to. They could come and take part of the financial sector. They could come and deal in financial instruments and currency exchange and all of the other things that had previously been allocated purely to British companies, to British banks and British stockbrokers. So it was obvious to the City Corporation that we would need a new plan with new policies, if only to provide the space to accommodate all of these people. However, as you will all be aware, I'm sure, the City of London is the historic centre of London. It's been there for 2,000 years, ever since some drunken Romans sailed up the river and ran aground. And luckily ran aground at a point where there were two very low hills alongside the river on the north bank. One of them where St Paul's now stands, and the other where the Lloyd's building stands, Cornhill. And that was an ideal place to build a settlement. South London was no good. Sorry, I didn't say South London is no good. I said South London was no good for them to build that settlement because, of course, in those days, there was no embankment on the south side of the river, and the river flooded into a very marshy area. So the north bank with these low hills was ideal. And from that day onwards, London was about trade. The Romans built a settlement for import-export, and 2,000 years later, it's still going strong, doing exactly the same thing, except now it's done through virtual trade on computers rather than in actual goods being unloaded off ships and traded in the warehouses. So that's a tremendous heritage. And if you're thinking of new planning policies for a place, you destroy those mechanisms, those networks, and that heritage at your peril. After all, it's one of the greatest assets that you have. It's a 2,000-year trading history. And a 2,000-year trading history built on a very simple ingredient. The key to the city's success has always been, and will always be, gossip. If you're in the middle of a desert, you need water holes. But people go to water holes for two reasons. The first reason is they need water, quite obviously. But the second, and probably more important reason as far as most of them are concerned, is that's where the gossip is. They go to the water hole to learn the gossip and to take it back to their houses. So even in a very basic society in the middle of a desert, people, as social animals, depend on gossip. Now, you multiply the complexity of the organization of the society to something like the City of London, and you think, oh, people are far too sophisticated. Not a bit of it. Gossip is just, if not even more important. And gossip, or at least the gossip we all really want, and which you'll hopefully wheedle out of me towards the end of the evening, is the gossip that will not go onto the internet. It's something that you'll only get face-to-face, the hot gossip, the juicy gossip. I had a group of 9-year-old school children who came down from a little school in Cumbria about 18 months ago to visit London. The headmistress had seen something I'd done on television and emailed me and said, would I be prepared to tell them about the city because they were fascinated by the tall buildings? And I said, yes, I'd be delighted. And then I thought to myself, well, how on earth am I going to explain the City of London to a group of 9-year-old children who've never been further than Carlisle? And they hadn't. Anyway, we built the whole day up. They got on the train to come down. Radio Cumbria rang me on the phone and interviewed me live on air, and they were listening on their little transistor radios, and they'd been interviewed the day before, so it was a really big build-up. They arrived in the city, they came into our marketing suite, and they saw a model of the City of London with a cluster of towers and the river, and their mouths open, and they looked at it, eyes wide open. And I said, "No, then," I said, "I've got to explain how this works, and it looks really complicated." And they all nodded. And I said, "Do any of you know about beehives?" Oh, the hands went up. They all knew about beehives. They were all keen to tell me exactly how a beehive worked. And I said, "Well, if you look at that cluster of tall things over there, those are all beehives. Except inside, you won't find bees, you'll find bankers." Now then, I said, "What do bees do in a bee?" They make honey, of course. Well, I said, in this case, it's money, not honey. But I said, in order to do so, what do the bees need? Oh, well, the bees need to go and get nectar. Exactly, I said. And the bankers need a pub and a restaurant to go to get their nectar. And what happens when bees are gathering nectar? Oh, they brush up against the stamens and they collect the pollen and they take it to another plant. They knew all about this. I said, exactly. Now, those bankers, when they're getting their nectar, are busy overhearing what other bankers are saying, the gossip. And then they fly back to their beehive or bank, and they take that gossip with them and they make more money out of it. And a few days later, I had this wonderful card with a drawing on the front, painting, in fact, on the front, of pinstriped bankers with wings flying through the alleyways of the city. And I thought to myself, well, okay, the 9-year-olds understand how the City of London works. It can't be that complicated. Even a banker should be able to understand. So there we have this, 1985, this boring place, except that it has all of this gossip going on. So it's working, but it's not very attractive. And people from other countries who wanted to take up business in the city needed a rather different product. They were used to something very different. They were used to cafe society. They were used to businesses in areas which had other attractions, had nightlife, had hotels nearby, and all of the other things you need for a more rounded place. So we thought that the answer in the city was to make it a more varied and more rounded place to attract the companies that wanted to be in London, and more importantly, to attract the best staff from around the world and to retain them. There were people who had other ideas. There was a certain American gentleman called G. Ware Travelstead. I know it doesn't sound very likely, but that was his name. I've forgotten what the anagram was. We worked it out at one time. Maybe one of you can remember afterwards, but we did find a very good anagram for his name. Anyway, he had been retained by a large American bank called Credit Suisse First Boston to find them a base in London so they could take a big slug of this financial action. And he'd looked at a site in the city, a whole block between Cornhill and Throgmorton Street. And he thought that it would be possible to just clear this site and put up a 1 million square foot tower. And he seemed very surprised when the city corporation said, well, there are listed buildings, there's an ancient monuments, there are a couple of livery halls, and the whole lot's in a conservation area. And anyway, it isn't a square site, so why would you be putting a square building on a very irregular medieval plan? And he said, well, because we're a very powerful bank. Why don't you do what we say? It's usually, you know American logic, I'm sure you've heard it elsewhere. And we obviously couldn't do that, wouldn't do that, didn't want to do that. And in a fit of pique one day, he went off for a walk around Docklands, came across an area where Mr. Heseltine and Margaret Thatcher had declared there should be a planning-free zone at a place called Canary Wharf. And he said, what's this for? And they said, well, it's to build small factories to re-employ the unemployed dockers in Docklands. He said, there are no rules? He said, no rules. No planners? No planners. Is there anything to stop me building Manhattan here? Oh, well, I suppose not. We hadn't thought of that. So, well, we all know what happened next. So here we have Canary Wharf being developed in the American model of how to do things, which, by the way, means building 1 million square foot towers with very large floor plates, which has dark space in the middle. And you know how well you're getting on in an American company about how much light you're given. You start your career in the dark near the lifts and the photocopiers. If you're not sacked in the first 6 months, you progress gradually towards a window. Then you move towards the corner of the building and have 2 windows. And if you're really successful, you start to go up floor by floor to the top. So you always know how well you're getting on. I've never quite worked out what happens when they get to the top floor, but maybe there's an ejector seat or something. But in British terms, of course, that wasn't the way we did things. And it doesn't allow for gossip other than internal gossip. The whole concept of the American company was bring everybody in before 9 o'clock in the morning, keep them there till as well long after 5 in the evening as you can, provide all the things they might need, like swimming pools and gyms and bars and cafeterias inside the building, so they won't need for anything. And that'll produce a wonderfully efficient company, because you can keep an eye on them. No, it won't, because the only gossip they'll get is the internal gossip. What you want your staff doing is walking from meeting to meeting between buildings in a real place where they'll bump into people, where they'll overhear things, where they'll pick things up on the grapevine as they go around. That's what we had. So we realized what we had to do was to try and produce a city that could provide extra accommodation and at the same time keep those networks. Luckily, there were a couple of developers called Lipton and Bradman, Sir Stuart Lipton and Godfrey Bradman, who were planning a redevelopment on derelict railway land at the northern edge of the city at a place that became known as Broadgate. And that showed that you could build what we called ground scrapers, buildings of no more than 10 stories in height, around good public spaces with shopping and bars and cafes and all of the other facilities that people needed, better connected to public transport, and with excellent areas that people would want to come and visit. The space in Broadgate, the Broadgate Circus, became the most popular public space in the city within 1 week of opening. So the spaces were working. And as a planner, that gives me the greatest thrill. Any fool can design a good building. It takes a genius to design a good space. And a place needs good spaces. Good architecture is a nice add-on. It's a nice extra. It's the icing. But if the cake isn't made from good ingredients, good architecture won't do anything for you. Get the spaces right, get the permeability right for the pedestrians to walk through, places they want to be, and the place will come alive. So Broadgate offered us an opportunity to build a slice of new city to expand with a model that fitted with the way the city worked. And there were countless other sites through the city which followed that sort of example. Another excellent example, of course, is Paternoster Square. And there again, another brilliant space, a room of the city where tourists and office workers equally want to come and spend time, right next to Wren's wonderful masterpiece, and with a collection of varied architectural buildings around it, but the space again being the most important thing. The thing I like most about the achievement of Paternoster Square, having had the decade almost of angst over it, and the occasional flight in a helicopter to Highgrove to be told how I should be doing it better. That's the hot gossip. We'd better keep that for later, I think. There were all sorts of people saying how you should design it, that it should be a pastiche building next to the cathedral and that modern architecture didn't have a place there. But I knew all the time that the most important thing was to get the space right, to get it back down to ground level so people could pass through it. Do you remember the old 1960s and 70s Paternoster Square that lasted until the 80s, where you had to go up steps and across that windswept podium with slab blocks on it? Very unattractive, nobody wanted to go there. So we had to get the spaces right, and I think we did. But the thing I find most curious and fascinating is the other aim I had was to get Temple Bar back into the city. And we had the ideal site, forming a real gateway so people would actually pass through it and it wouldn't just be a monument, and it was at the entrance to Paternoster Square. And I now love to stand underneath that gateway, which originally stood over Fleet Street and then went off on its holidays to Hertfordshire until after the last war, and then came back stone by stone. It's a well-travelled monument, that one. I love standing underneath it and hearing the American tourists saying how amazing it is that it managed to survive the Blitz, because it looks so right in its new location. That's the sort of development that's being carried out through the 80s and 90s and the turn of the century. But eventually, all of these ground scrapers weren't enough, and the city needed to build tall. Now, building tall is a last resort. It's not a first resort. Only build tall if you've run out of land and you still need to accommodate people because you're amazingly successful. Don't build tall because you think it'll make you more successful than you were before. City of London, very little land, just 1 square mile. Hong Kong, very little flat land to build on. Manhattan, surrounded by water. There's a reason for building tall. Canary Wharf, again, you could say the same, surrounded by water. But Elephant and Castle? Build a skyscraper? Did it make any difference? Isn't it still the Elephant and Castle, but now with a skyscraper? Frankfurt, that used to be a quiet market town. Now it's a quiet market town with skyscrapers. They thought they could compete with London by building tall. It made no difference. And the reason? Frankfurt is very boring. I've been there and I've told them it's the nightlife they need in Frankfurt, not the high-rise buildings. Nobody would choose to go to Frankfurt for a weekend. You wouldn't. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, yes, wonderful German cities, but not Frankfurt. The city, by saying that London has the best free sex in the world, why on earth would you? No need. And of course, this wonderful party attracts them. Soho, well, Westminster have killed Soho more or less by bringing family housing into Saturday night. One of the old banking halls in Cornhill is now Abacus nightclub, open till 4 in the morning or later, and there are stretched limos all the way from Abacus to Essex. The nightlife is in the City of London as well. Groups from South London hiring bars and bringing in their own DJs. The place is throbbing on a Saturday night. Now, who would have thought that? But of course, that means there's a party there on Thursday nights as well, when the bankers like to go out and party. That means they can party. We've done in Cheapside. The tops of so many of the new buildings have public facilities. Shard on the other side of the river, and wave to the people who've paid £30 each to go up that building. So a public facility at the top, extra space and a little pocket park at the base of the building. The cheese grater, 5 floors of public space underneath the building, and a nickname. The nicknames, by the way, started with the gherkin. And it showed that when the gherkin got its nickname, that people were falling in love with interesting contemporary buildings. And I thought, well, we better keep this going. So people said to me, well, okay, the gherkin, yes, very good. Now, where's the next one? What shape is it? What's the nickname? I had to think quickly. Well, I said, well, Richard Rogers is designing one opposite the Lloyd's building, and it's got a sloping front in order to not to impinge on the view of St. Paul's from Fleet Street. And that time it had serrations down the front as well, fins to protect it from sunshine. And I suddenly thought, well, Richard Rogers' wife, Ruth Rogers, runs one of the best restaurants in London. I could imagine her using one of those to grate the parmesan onto the pasta. So I said, well, it looks just like a cheese grater, and it's stuck. He's furious. She's thrilled, by the way, because I've managed to explain that it's named after her kitchen. So nicknames, then a walkie-talkie, a can of ham, a scalpel, and, well, I've lost track of them now. But they all indicate the change that's come over the city. And to finish this section, before we start the discussion, I'd just like to give you another picture. The picture, the image of the city that's used by the world's media now is the one that BBC News and BBC World use when they're talking about the City of London. And it's a view from Tate Modern across the Millennium Bridge with St. Paul's and a cluster of towers on the skyline, and hordes of tourists flocking into the city with their heads up, looking happy in expectation. Now compare that with the London Bridge view at the start, and I think if we have made a change over the last 30 years, and I do say we because it's involved a large number of planners, a large number of gifted architects from all over the world, and some inspired developers to get this change, and of course the leadership from the elected representatives in the city. It's been very much a team game. But if we have made a change, it's to put the place into workplace. Now, at that point, I think we ought to broaden out the discussion by starting our conversation, and then I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say, and hopefully you're going to throw a few virtual objects in my direction to see what I can do with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. A very, very amusing run through 30 years of the City of London. I wonder if I could start by asking you, you mentioned Broadgate as one of the first schemes that you worked on, which is the building now being rebuilt just to the side of Liverpool Street Station, for anyone who doesn't know it. Looking back, are there, with hindsight, are there mistakes that you have made that you would acknowledge now? Is there a way that you would have built somewhere like Broadgate so that it wouldn't come down 30 years later because it was no longer fit for purpose? Or is it, in fact, being rebuilt precisely because of the other successes that you've created? What are your kind of regrets?
When we started the process of redevelopment in the mid-80s that was necessary for the change in the city, a large number, in fact most of the buildings that were developed had to come down and people had to start again. Because the buildings of the 60s and 70s, the post-war buildings, had been designed with very limited floor-to-ceiling heights, very narrow slab widths, and had been built very cheaply and quickly because, obviously, materials were in short supply after the war. It was a shame that those buildings had to come down after 20 or 30 years and be completely removed, and we had to start again with a mucky hole in the ground, literally, and start from scratch. That's not very sustainable. The buildings that were built from the mid-80s onwards have much higher floor-to-ceiling heights to allow for underfloor cabling and a little bit of extra just in case. They're much wider to allow for open plan working, for group working, which is what's required now. There were dealing floors in buildings which were even wider, and generally an atrium through the middle of the building, which meant that the upper floors were like donuts to let light in from the middle as well as from the outsides. Now, of course, there's the flexibility there to make another dealing floor by putting a floor across the atrium, or indeed to extend the atrium downwards to make more general office space. So there's a flexibility there. The buildings that are now 25 to 30 years old have the ability to retain at least their structure when they're being renewed or replaced. So across the city at the moment, you'll see projects where the concrete slabs and the concrete columns are retained, the outside walls are removed to be replaced. Sometimes it's possible to achieve an extra floor or two on the top of the building because the mechanical plant that was required is now more efficient and can go into the basement, and that leaves space at the top of the building. The external envelope can probably be better replaced by something which is more energy efficient and possibly even more architecturally inspired. I mean, the mid-80s were not the best period architecturally, so taking the suit of clothes off and putting a new suit of clothes around is probably a good idea. And of course, after 25 or 30 years, you're going to need new cabling and new elevators in the building. They're worn out. At the end of that process, for half the cost, in half the time, and with much greater certainty for getting planning permission, you've got a brand new building for which you can charge top rent and which tenants will move into as a brand new building. That's much more sustainable. Occasionally, you have a building where you need a particular specification, where you need to remove a building, but that's now the rarity rather than the rule. In terms of Broadgate, I think it's a great credit to Broadgate and to Peter Foggo and Arups, the original designers, and to the developers, that it's possible to take out two buildings in Broadgate and put in one larger one, because UBS, the largest bank in Switzerland, is there, but wants a larger building and wants to remain there. Well, that's something you don't turn away lightly. But taking out two pieces of Lego and putting in one larger one, whilst keeping the spaces and the permeability, and in fact enhancing the Broadgate circus, I think is a great credit to it. Because as I said earlier, the important thing about Broadgate is that it got the spaces right. It got the mixture of uses right. It got the permeability right. It's inevitable that there will be a fluctuation in what is required by office occupiers, and I think that flexibility was built in from the start. So I like what's happening at Broadgate now. I think everywhere should be designed to change. I'm not one of these people who believes that anywhere should be set in aspic. Change is the only constant in a healthy city.
What about the cultural changes that have happened over the 30 years in London, especially in the City of London? So becoming a more cosmopolitan city, a more global city, a more global identity, and really having some parallels with Shanghai and New York and other global cities in terms of its culture. Are there examples in your 30 years at the city where the decisions you made tried to maintain a distinct kind of London feel to the kind of buildings and places and spaces you were approving?
I suppose there are in some ways, in the sense that I was a strong believer in the merits of a medieval street plan, the narrow alleyways and the little spaces. An American planner looking at that would have said, well, this is a complete mess, let's clear this away and start again. But I realized that there was a virtue in that needed to be retained. Of course, there are many fine buildings in the city that should be preserved and retained. They add character to the city and provide very useful accommodation as well, because not everybody wants to be in a modern building. I suppose you could say there are institutions like the British pub that are vital to the city. I've always said the reason that London is more successful, one of the reasons London is more successful than Paris, is the comparison between the British pub and the French cafe. In a French cafe, people sit at tables with their friends, and the news they hear is the news of their friends. but they probably know that anyway. In a pub, you generally stand up to drink, and you not only hear what your friends are saying, but you can quite easily hear what the next group of people is saying. And as the evening goes on, if you're sensible, you'll back towards that other group. And as the beer goes down, you'll pick up their juiciest gossip. Now, in the city, that could be worth a lot of money. In fact, if you go into the Royal Exchange, where they have that very expensive cafe where you have to take out a mortgage to buy a cappuccino, as you go in, especially if you're taking a group of people in, they say, no photographs inside. And I've often wondered why, and then I realized there's a fortune to be made by a trained lip reader in that room. Because that's where people go to have the really hottest gossip of all, where they go to talk about the boss or about a deal. It's those underlying social networks which I think are the things that are most important to preserve and provide more scope for, to grow, if you like. So it develops organically from what it already is as a successful city. But at the same time, you have to check time. Planning is always a compromise. The developer would like a building 10 times as tall. The architect would like a building 5 times more beautiful. The planners would just like them to get on with it and get it finished. You have different parameters, and the public would probably prefer it not to happen anyway because it's going to disrupt their work. Planning is a compromise, but if you can design something that is adaptable, you won't design something that's perfect for 100 or 150 years in a place like the city, but at least something that's adaptable enough to maintain at least the structure of that building. And I'm very pleased by the number that are now being reclad and aren't simply being razed to the ground.
Can we talk at this juncture about foresight and the next 30 years? If you were to, I'm sure lots of authorities would have you, let's say the GLA, rather than just the City of London, the entire London Authority were to say, Peter, we want you to be chief planner, 30-year contract. What are the challenges that are facing London in the next 30 years, and what's the role of planning in addressing them?
The biggest threat, as I see it at the moment, to London, and any of you who read The Guardian will know what I'm going to say, is too much inward investment. There is too much money coming into London at the moment, and it's not being used for things which are good for London. And what I'm talking about isn't overseas ownership of buildings in London. It doesn't matter who owns the buildings in London as long as the activity is here. In fact, it's great if people from all over the world want a slice of London. Most of the office buildings in the city are owned by overseas firms or conglomerates. That's fine. And I don't mind development money coming in to build housing in London. What I resent is to build residential apartments that are not going to be lived in. Piles of safe deposit boxes, as I've described them recently. All the way from Vauxhall to Battersea Power Station, the Vauxhall, Nine Elms, Battersea area, they're building a ghost town. Packing buildings in very close, selling them off plan in Hong Kong to people whose only concern is, can you see Tower Bridge from my apartment? I'm living in one of these blocks in the city. There is one at the Heron. 30% of the owners can't be contacted to form a Middle East. As we know, it's on the point of meltdown, and they're desperately getting their money out into London, wanting to put it into bricks and mortar. But none of these are homes. They're piles of gold bricks or safe deposit boxes in the sky. And London desperately needs homes. Not only are they building empty flats, but they're driving up the cost of every house and flat in London to the point where the people who need to be here and want to live here can't afford to. I think we've got to find a way of punitive taxation for empty residential property, so people are really fined for keeping a place empty at a time when they're so needed. And I think the other thing is we've got to rediscover rented housing. If you compare London with Paris or Berlin or Vienna, in those cities, most people rent their accommodation. In fact, throughout Scandinavia and most of Germany, most people rent rather than own. Now, for a couple of generations, successive American and British governments, whether it's Democrat or Republican, Labour or Conservative, have gone out of their way to stigmatise rented housing. They've said to people, if you don't own your own home, you're not a full stakeholder in society. Those are the buzzwords they use. And our clever friends, the bankers, even managed to invent a way of lending money to people that couldn't afford to pay it back. It's called collateralized debt obligations, and it was very complicated, but as we all know, it caused a banking crash. Now, if you go over to a city, if you go back to having a city where most of the residential property is rented, it's much more efficient. I don't know anybody who rents a flat and then doesn't live in it. Why would you? So you get more people in the area, which is what cities are meant to be about. And if people move jobs, then they move home more readily because they're only renting. And above all of that, all that money tied up in housing is now in the economy, for a real economy. I mean, the OECD have spotted this current trick in Britain. The British economy is growing. No, it isn't. House prices are going up. It's not the same thing at all. House price inflation is the only miracle that's keeping the country afloat at the moment, and that's achieving nothing. So I'm all for people investing in development in London, but let it be development that London and Londoners need. And I'm not just saying indigenous Londoners, I'm talking about the people who want to be here. Which is why Boris won't employ me for the next 30 years.
I'd like to open it up for questions from the floor. I'll take 2 at a time, and if you could wait for the microphone and say your name. I'll take the gentleman at the very back over there, and then the lady in the front row over here.
Hello, my name's Guy. I'm actually a planning consultant, so we're used to be in the same profession, so I won't make it too technical.
Good.
Was keen to ask you about what you got up to at Highgrove, but I'll stay clear of that one. It's a question about the debate on tall buildings across London, and I'd be interested in your view, firstly, in the city, whether you see clustering of tall buildings as the way forward, and more generally on London's skyline, how you feel about the debate that London's at its capacity for tall buildings, or whether you have the opportunity to do more.
Okay, hold that for a second. Yep.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I am a postgraduate student at LSE, and I'm interested in public space. That's kind of my area. And I wondered, and you kind of touched upon it just then, I think the city is great, but I wondered what you think about arguments that might say that you've planned ordinary people out of the city by planning workers and tourists in. And I wonder whether you've thought about ways that the city can become more equitable and open to a wider majority of people in the future.
Okay, 2 very good hot topics. Tall buildings, I've already touched on, but I should develop that a little. If you're going to build tall, I believe you should build clusters. I believe you should group tall buildings together. You minimise the environmental impact and you maximise the benefit. In the City of London, that cluster of towers is in the eastern end of the city, as far as possible from St Paul's and out of the strategic views, so it doesn't interfere with those views of the cathedral. And they're surrounded by 20 stations and 7 underground lines. So it's a very sustainable place to build them, and they add to the city's business offer, and the fact that they're all filling up before they're even finished is proof that they're needed. That's very different from what's happening in a place like Vauxhall, where, having got away with one tower, thanks to John Prescott, against the local authorities' advice, they now have a precedent for building other towers, because, of course, the British planning system is based entirely on precedent. Once you've made one mistake, you can make a lot more. So that awful aerosol can of a thing that Vauxhall Cross, that you can see all the way from Victoria, is now to be accompanied by the Twin Towers, which originally was going to be a mixed-use development with offices, residential and hotel, but blow me down if the offices are no longer viable, and they had to go back to Wandsworth and get a new permission that's even higher and with no offices in at all. I don't think that those buildings, as I said earlier, are necessary, and therefore you shouldn't be building tall. Build tall if you have to, but don't build tall simply for to increase what's on the site unless it's actually necessary to build it. So the idea of dotting tall buildings right across London, I think, is a disaster. I'm all for having clusters elsewhere than the city. Canary Wharf is a very sensible place to have a cluster. As I said, it's surrounded by water. You need to make a density. I think you could probably have a new cluster of towers in a place like Croydon, because Croydon is being regenerated at the moment, and if you want to have more employment in Croydon, that would be a good place to do it. It provides an identifier as well. But the idea of dotting them all the way along the river from Bermondsey to Battersea, I think, is absolutely awful, and it's ruining London. If you want to build high-density housing, you don't build tall anyway, because tall buildings don't make high-density housing. The GLC knew what to do back in the 1970s in Vauxhall Bridge Road, where they were building 6 to 8 story blocks like donuts around the edge of a street block, looking inwards into wonderful green space. And when I recently did a piece for BBC London News about what was going on in Vauxhall, I dragged them up Vauxhall Bridge Road into the little space in the middle of one of these developments and said, that's what should be being built. And a little old lady came up to us in her 80s and she said, what are you filming for? And we told her. And I said, actually, this is a competition We're offering the penthouse over at Vauxhall in the top of the tower to somebody in this estate to swap for their flat. Are you interested? Oh, no, dear, she said. She said, this is a real place, she said. That's not a place over there, she said. That's just a tower. She said, no, I wouldn't want to live there. And I thought, well, if an 80-year-old lady can understand it, why can't Boris?
And on any of your decisions that you feel might have planned...
we didn't do spaces, did we? I'm sorry.
Yeah, planning ordinary people out of the city.
Yes, indeed. People often talk about the privatization of public space. And I think what's important to bear in mind is a lot of the new space that's being created was never space before. It isn't being privatized, it's extra space. On the back of developments, the planners are getting a public benefit from getting space around or within the development that the public have access to. Now, I don't know what it is you can't do in Paternoster Square other than pitch your tents and have occupy within the square. And frankly, it would have got in the way of a lot of people who want to use the square, of all kinds, tourists, workers, and others. And anyway, there was plenty of space outside in front of St. Paul's Cathedral to have occupy, and there was no problem in the city in having it in the city. It was only moved when it became an acute social problem with homeless children and drug addicts in the middle of the operation, and it had to be closed down. But while it was simply a protest, it was allowed, the city worked around it, and there was space to have it. And I think it's vitally important that a city should have opportunity for that kind of interaction. Equally, the city is now much more open with its nightlife. As I said earlier, groups from South London come into the city at the weekends and bring DJs and take the bars, and the rappers are going at very high volume. Luckily, it doesn't disturb residents because there are only 9,000 residents in the city and they're in very small areas of the city. So it's an ideal place to have that nightlife. So that nightlife is helping to make the city more accessible to more people. But I know exactly what you mean because a few years ago, the chief executive said to me, you've got to come up with your objectives for your annual appraisal. What are your objectives for the year? And I said, rather flippantly, singing and dancing in the streets. And he said, well, you can't do that. I said, trust me. So about 2 months before I was due for my appraisal, I thought, what am I going to do about that stupid thing I said? And the City London Festival was coming up. So we managed to get a project with the local schools in the city fringe area around the city where the kids developed something on the history of the city. And one lunchtime they came in and they marched and danced through the streets of the city and ended up in Paternoster Square, partly to fulfill my objective, but also because it was a great thing to do and the festival thought it was great. And one of the teachers came up to me at the end. They'd had their picnic lunch sitting on the floor. And the teacher said to me, one of the lads has just said to me, we didn't know we was allowed to be here, miss. And I thought that was very telling because, yes, cities can become very exclusive places. I discovered the city as a teenager, able to roam around the streets and fell in love with it and became passionate about it. And I'd like to think that kids today could do the same. So, yes, it is something I'm very aware of. And I think things like the nightlife, things like having more tourism are more likely to get a broader cross-section of people into the place. But I think it's something you do have to be very aware of. And it's not just true of the city. I think it's increasingly true of many parts. I'm more worried about some of the residential areas with gated communities. And, frankly, if you put a hood up, instantly there's a police car alongside you.
Let's take
yes.
2 more questions.
Please.
The gentleman on the very end in the second row. And the gentleman here with the tie.
Thank you. My name is James. I'm a city liveryman. What do you say to the proposal that we change the postcodes of Canary Wharf to EC5, EC6, EC7 and EC8 and apply the principles you described to Canary Wharf? And instead of a square mile, we have around 2 miles.
Okay. And next question, sir.
My name is Paul and I enjoy walking around London. I understand that London has more CCTV cameras than any other city. How important, what emphasis is given to security, both national and personal, when developing these new buildings?
Well, Canary Wharf were very keen to become part of the city. In fact, they approached the City Corporation when it was first designed, wanting to become part of the city. The problem for the city is if the city was seen as a political organisation now, was seen to be expansionist, that would pose a great threat to surrounding authorities, and there would be quite a political backlash. Remember, the City of London is apolitical. There's a business vote as well as a residential vote, and all the members of the city corporation are independent. They don't stand to represent political parties. If the city expanded or sought to expand, or on the other hand, if the residential population grew in the city to the point where most of the electors were residents and started to elect political representatives, the city would be abolished because it wouldn't be tolerated amongst the other 32 boroughs of London by being smaller. It's only tolerated because it is unique and because it doesn't seem to threaten them, because it doesn't have any party politics. It's independent. I don't worry too much about Canary Wharf. When I go to Croydon, I say, do you know, you guys were the first Canary Wharf, the first satellite of central London, office satellite to take the overflow from the West End and the city. And they're thrilled. Do you know, they smile from ear to ear. And then I go on down to Canary Wharf and I say, do you know, you guys are the second Croydon? And they don't seem the least bit impressed. But the thing with satellites is they always heat up faster and they always cool down faster. And at this moment in London, offices are only being built in the city, to a degree around Victoria Station by Land Securities, and apart from that, almost nowhere. Canary Wharf is now only building residential apart from some very small secondary offices because there's so much more money to be made out of it. Now the city is sticking to its last. You know, Canary Wharf might come, Canary Wharf might go. We couldn't have managed without it in the 1990s because the city couldn't accommodate all the people that wanted to be there. So Canary Wharf was very important. But I think Canary Wharf will morph into some buildings and make way for redevelopment. But of course, that was in a day when even terrorists were trying not to kill people. It was trying to be property damage. We're in a totally different era now, and the last thing one would say is that terrorism has any positive thing to it at all. CCTV cameras, it's amazing how resilient people are to them. We're surrounded by them. I don't know whether people will feel safer as a result and therefore don't mind having them. There are some people who seem to resent them. Americans in particular seem to resent having CCTV. I think they have helped to make London safer. But as Jane Jacobs said in her books in the 1960s, the best security is the human eyeball. It's soft security. It's people in a place that give the best security. It's us all observing what's going on. But whenever any new development is built, yes, of course, security is built in. The most distressing side of it is that a lot of developers or occupiers want a ring of specially reinforced bollards around the building, which I always think look awful. So I'm much more in favour of the soft security than the hard security. And modern terrorism, after all, is about crowded places rather than the specific targets of the City of London. I think things have moved on a great deal. In fact, horrible things we're hearing about in the last few days indicate that it's not even centres, crowded places that terrorists are targeting. So a worrying sign of the future, but the greatest strength in London is the fact that it is the most cosmopolitan city on the world, that we have all of these races mixing together and exchanging ideas, because if there are solutions to be found to anything, including tourism, that's the way to find it.
Okay, 2 more questions. The lady at the back with the glasses had her hand up very quickly, and the gentleman at the very back with his hand stretched the highest I can see. Okay, yep, right there, Alex. Yep.
Hi, my name...
A 16-year-old work experience student working on the Royal Mint Court in the late 80s, and then as a young graduate, as I said, through the 90s and 2000s. I want to say a couple of things. One is just...
Must be a question.
Okay, sorry. It will end with a question. What I wanted to say was actually I find the developments that happened in the city in the last 30 years really admirable in its boldness of vision, coupled with I would like to say, British pragmatism of making things work and things change, which you've spoken about. What I'd actually like to hear is your thoughts with a broader vision of planning across the United Kingdom within the context of the the NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework, and the Localism Bill, and how that may sit with interest groups and NIMBYism as a barrier to the boldness of development which we have witnessed in the City of London. Thank you.
All right, well, accessibility, of course, vitally important. It's no good having cities that large numbers of people can't access and can't use conveniently. I've never forgotten the experience of breaking my ankle while I was doing some cross-country skiing in Vermont, and I'd already booked to have a weekend in Boston at the end of the holiday. And going around Boston on calipers with an ankle in plaster, it suddenly came home to me as a planner just how inaccessible public transport can be. So it was a very useful lesson for me. The City of London certainly, and indeed the rest of London, has taken this seriously. It's very difficult, of course, with a public transport system largely built in the 19th century, to install elevators at underground stations. You can see how little by little the underground system, at least the subsurface part, if not the deep tube, is modifying stations, and when new trains come in, they're much more accessible. The streets are being modified at every road junction in the city. The street is raised to pavement level, so it slows the traffic down and it allows people to cross the road more easily. All of the buildings that are designed are very carefully monitored for accessibility to ensure that everybody can go through the front door and that a person in a wheelchair doesn't have to be sent around to some secondary entrance at the back of the building. All of that is taken very seriously, and it's vitally important. And it makes the city more efficient all round anyway, but by and large. Although I was fascinated the other day to see something I've been hoping to see for a very long time, and that is an accessible wheelchair. A wheelchair that can go anywhere and doesn't need expensive modifications to the environment. And I was passing St. Paul's Cathedral the other day, and there was a chap in a wheelchair taking photographs. And the wheelchair was mechanical and was able to lift itself up. It had a number of small wheels. It could go over curbs. And I was absolutely amazed by the maneuverability of this wheelchair that he was in. I've said many times, for the amount of money we've spent on modifying the environment, if we'd given a fraction of that to Mr. Dyson to invent a really good wheelchair, it might actually have been a better plan. So let's perhaps have both, shall we? And your point about, shall we say, the rest of the country. I was hoping not to be controversial this evening. No, I wasn't. Unfortunately, we live in a country that doesn't value planning. In the rest of the world, planning was established to make cities better, or to establish great cities. Think of Germany, you think of Scandinavia, France with Paris. Planning was there to create grand cities and to maintain them. Not so in Britain. In Britain, at the end of the war, something called town and country planning was invented. And the reason? Not to make cities great, but to protect the countryside from the expansion of our towns. The landed gentry didn't like the smell. So they set up a system to constrain the towns. I think we still have that mixed vision of planning, that ambivalence towards planning, and it's demonstrated by the previous and the current incumbents in Westminster. The previous government, under Tony Blair, set up a special ministry called Communities and Local Government, and planning was put into that ministry. And it was handcrafted, that ministry, especially for a powerful but dysfunctional politician called John Prescott. They thought it was somewhere they could put him where he couldn't do any harm. And that was the attitude towards planning. Stick old John Prescott in it, he won't cause any damage if he's only doing planning. And blow me down when the Tories came in if they didn't have the dead spit in Eric Pickles. Ideal, perfectly made for Eric Pickles. Another extremely dangerous politician, because he's powerful, and totally dysfunctional. So what you put him in a ministry where he can't do any harm. I think it's very sad that we have this attitude towards planning. I would say that, wouldn't I, as a planner? And I think the answer is it's got to be regrown via the community. You talked about NIMBYism, but I think, in fact, the answer is through neighbourhood planning. We've got to get the politicians out of planning. They can't be trusted with it. We've got to get planning back into the hands of the community and professionals. And I think working together, professionals with the local community can find out what the local community wants. Local communities aren't against change, they aren't against expansion, they just want to be able to say how it should happen and have a hand in how it should happen. And I think remote politicians in boroughs or elected mayors don't get that. They want to make a grand intervention to get votes, knowing they're only going to be there for 4 years. Something like a garden bridge or a floating park. You know, it's bread and circuses. It's not to do with making places better. So Let's agree to get the politicians out of it, shall we? And while we're at it, let's move Westminster. If the Scots are going to have independence by tomorrow, then we need an English Parliament. And we shouldn't have it in London. London would be far better off without Westminster. I mean, without the politicians in Westminster. And the place I recommend, because it needs to be central, is Ashby de la Zouche, because it'll really annoy the French.
It's 7 o'clock, just gone, so I'm going to have to draw things to a close. And I know there were lots of questions unanswered, which I apologise for. But thank you so much to our thoughtful and intelligent audience for such great questions, and to Peter for a fantastic wander through the streets of London. For anyone who missed it, who you know would enjoy it, this will be available on the RSA's website as an archived video replay. And I want to say, do join us downstairs for a drink and a chance to talk more. It only remains for me to thank the Bossum family for supporting this lecture series, and their generosity makes this possible. So please say thanks again to Peter Rees. Thank you.